The thunder of hooves echoed across the open plain as Cecilia Vaughn raced toward the horizon, her heart pounding faster than her horse's galloping stride. Behind her lay Chicago with all its broken promises and deadly secrets. Ahead lay nothing but uncertainty and the desperate hope that her past wouldn't catch up to her before she could disappear completely. It was June 1875 when Cecilia arrived in Mineral Point, Wyoming Territory, her face hidden beneath the brim of a modest bonnet and her possessions reduced to what could fit in 2 weathered saddlebags. The small mining town sprawled before her, nestled in a valley with mountains rising in the distance. Wooden buildings lined the main street, their facades weathered by harsh winters and the relentless summer sun. Men in dusty clothing moved between the general store, saloons, and livery, while a few women hurried about their business, their long skirts sweeping the dirt road. Cecilia drew her horse to a stop outside the town's only hotel, a 2-story clapboard building with peeling white paint and a sign that creaked in the breeze. She sat motionless for a moment, scanning the street for any sign of familiar faces or suspicious glances. After 2 weeks on the road, changing direction whenever her instincts warned her, she'd learned to trust the prickling sensation at the back of her neck that meant danger. Today, she felt nothing but exhaustion. "Need help with your horse, madam." A stable boy appeared at her side, his young face open and curious. Cecilia nodded, dismounting with stiff legs. "Thank you," she said, passing him the reins and enough coins to ensure good care for her mare. The animal deserved it after carrying her so far. Inside the hotel, a stern-faced woman looked up from behind a wooden counter. Her gray hair was pulled into a severe bun, and she regarded Cecilia with undisguised suspicion. "Rooms 50 cents a night," she said curtly. "Breakfast included, dinner's extra." "I'll take it for a week," Cecilia replied, counting out the money from her dwindling funds. She would need to find work soon. "Name?" The woman dipped a pen in ink. Cecilia hesitated for only a fraction of a second. "Cecilia Turner." The lie came easily now after so many towns and so many different names. "Traveling alone." The woman's eyebrows rose slightly. "Yes, I'm a widow." Another practiced lie. "Looking for work." The woman's expression softened marginally. "Well, Miss Turner, room 4 is yours." "Top of the stairs to the right." She slid a key across the counter. "I'm Mrs. Holloway. Breakfast is at 6. Don't be late." Cecilia nodded her thanks and climbed the narrow staircase. The room was small but clean, a single bed with an iron frame, a washstand with a chipped basin, and a window overlooking the main street. She set her bags down and sank onto the bed, finally allowing herself to acknowledge the bone-deep weariness that had been her constant companion. 3 months ago, she had been Cecilia Vaughn, the daughter of a respected Chicago businessman. 3 months ago, she had discovered the truth about her father's enterprises, the bribes, the threats, the blood on his hands. 3 months ago, she had made the fatal mistake of confronting him with evidence that could destroy him. She had fled Chicago in the dead of night after her father's men had made it clear what happened to those who threatened Edward Vaughn's empire. The bullet that had grazed her shoulder was a reminder of how close she'd come to death. She touched the spot through her dress, wincing at the memory. Cecilia rose and went to the window, watching as the sun began its descent behind the mountains. Mineral Point seemed peaceful enough, a far cry from Chicago's bustling streets and dangerous secrets. Perhaps here, in this dusty corner of Wyoming, she could find a moment's peace before moving on, because she would have to move on. She always did. Morning came with the sound of wagons rumbling down the main street and the scent of coffee and bacon wafting up from below. Cecilia dressed quickly in her plainest dress, a dark blue cotton that had seen better days. She pinned her auburn hair into a simple knot at the nape of her neck and practiced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. The dining room was half full when she descended. "Mrs. Holloway nodded toward an empty table in the corner, and Cecilia made her way there, avoiding the curious glances of the other guests. "Coffee?" A young girl approached with a steaming pot. "Yes, please." As she sipped the strong brew, Cecilia observed the room. Mostly men, miners, and cowboys by the look of them, with a few women who were likely local shopkeepers or teachers. No one gave her more than a passing glance, which suited her perfectly. After breakfast, she ventured out onto the main street. The morning air was crisp and clear, carrying the scent of pine from the surrounding hills. She moved purposefully, stopping first at the general store to inquire about employment opportunities. "No openings here," the shopkeeper said, barely looking up from his ledger. "Try the dressmaker down the street. Heard she's looking for help." The dressmaker, a plump woman named Mrs. Finch, did indeed need an assistant, but frowned at Cecilia's hands. "Ever worked a needle before, Miss Turner?" "Some," Cecilia admitted. Her embroidery had once been praised in Chicago society, but practical sewing was another matter. Mrs. Finch looked unconvinced. "Well, I need someone who can work quickly and precisely. Don't think you're what I'm looking for." By midday, Cecilia had been turned away from the school, no teaching positions available. The doctor's office already had a nurse, and the bakery wanted someone stronger for lifting flour sacks. She paused outside the saloon, considering her options. She could sing, had been trained in piano and voice since childhood, but the thought of performing in a saloon made her stomach tighten with anxiety. "You won't find what you're looking for in there," a deep voice said behind her. Cecilia whirled around, her hand instinctively reaching for the small knife hidden in her pocket. A man stood watching her, his posture relaxed but alert. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with sun-darkened skin and eyes the color of a storm-swept sky. A dusty Stetson shaded his face and a star-shaped badge glinted on his vest. "I'm not looking for anything in particular," she replied cautiously. The man's mouth quirked in a half-smile. "Everyone's looking for something in a place like this." He touched the brim of his hat. "Sheriff Xavier Garrison, and you must be the new arrival Mrs. Holloway mentioned." Cecilia stiffened. Of course the hotel owner would report a single woman traveling alone to the local authorities. It was standard practice in small towns. "Cecilia Turner," she said, offering her best approximation of a demure smile. "I'm just passing through." "Most people are." His gaze was disconcertingly direct, though most don't spend their first day in town looking quite so desperately for work. "Is that a crime, Sheriff Garrison?" He chuckled. "No, madam, just an observation." He glanced up the street. "Have you tried the Silver Star Ranch? Old man Miller's looking for a housekeeper since his wife passed. It's about 5 miles out of town, but it's honest work and he's a fair employer." Cecilia hesitated. A position outside town would provide some distance from prying eyes, but also isolation that could be dangerous if her father's men found her. "Thank you for the suggestion," she said finally. "How would I find this ranch?" "Follow the main road west out of town. Can't miss it." Sheriff Garrison studied her for a moment longer. "I'd be happy to accompany you, Miss Turner. Roads aren't always safe for a lady traveling alone." "I've managed this far," she replied, perhaps too sharply. Something flickered in his eyes, curiosity, perhaps, or suspicion. "As you wish. But if you change your mind, you'll find me at the jailhouse." He nodded once and continued down the street, leaving Cecilia to watch his retreating figure. She didn't trust the law, couldn't, after what she'd learned in Chicago, but there was something about Sheriff Garrison that made her want to believe his offer was genuine. Still, she had survived by being cautious, and she wouldn't stop now. The livery stable was her next stop, where she collected her mare and paid for another day's boarding. The stable owner, a weathered man named Johnson, offered directions to the Silver Star Ranch that matched the sheriff's. "Old Miller's got a good spread," Johnson confirmed. "Lost his missus to the fever last winter. Place has gone a bit to seed since then, but the land's solid and the cattle healthy." He eyed Cecilia speculatively. "You thinking of applying for the housekeeper position?" "Perhaps," she answered noncommittally. "Do you know if anyone else has shown interest?" Johnson snorted. "Few have tried. Miller's particular and his son's not much for conversation. Good folk, mind you, just—" He shrugged. "Set in their ways." Cecilia thanked him and mounted her mare. The ride west took less than an hour, the road winding through rolling hills dotted with sagebrush and wildflowers. The Silver Star Ranch appeared suddenly around a bend, a sturdy log house with a wide porch, several outbuildings, and a large barn. Beyond stretched fenced pastures where cattle grazed under the watchful eyes of mounted cowboys. As Cecilia approached, a man emerged from the barn. He was older, his face deeply lined and his hair more salt than pepper, but he stood straight and moved with purpose. He watched her approach, one hand shading his eyes against the afternoon sun. "Mr. Miller?" Cecilia called as she drew near. "That's right," he answered, his voice gruff. "What can I do for you, miss?" Cecilia dismounted, keeping a respectful distance. "I'm Cecilia Turner. I heard in town that you might be looking for a housekeeper." Miller's bushy eyebrows rose. "Did you now? And what makes you think you're suited for such work?" It was a fair question. Cecilia had never been a housekeeper, had grown up with servants handling such tasks. But desperation was a powerful motivator, and she had always been a quick learner. "I'm hardworking and thorough," she said, meeting his gaze steadily. "I can cook, clean, and manage a household. I'm not afraid of long hours, and I keep to myself." Miller studied her for a long moment. "Where are you from, Miss Turner?" "Back east," she replied vaguely. "I've been traveling westward for some time." "Alone. I'm a widow." Miller nodded slowly as if this explained something. "Job pays $15 a month plus room and board, Sunday afternoons off. If it doesn't work out, we part ways, no hard feelings." It was less than she'd hoped for, but more than she had. "When would you like me to start?" "Tomorrow, soon enough." Miller gestured toward the house. "I'll show you your quarters now if you've a mind to accept." The room was small but private, attached to the main house but with its own entrance. It held a narrow bed, a chest of drawers, and a small table with a lamp. The window looked out over the pastures, with mountains visible in the distance. "Used to be the sewing room," Miller explained. "My Eliza would sit by that window and mend while watching the sunset." His voice softened on his wife's name. "Been empty since she passed." "It's lovely," Cecilia said sincerely. "I'll take good care of it." Miller nodded curtly. "Supper's at 6. You can meet my son then. He runs most of the ranch operations these days." He paused at the door. "One more thing, Miss Turner. We're simple folk here. Don't much care what brings a woman like you to a place like this, long as you do your work and don't bring trouble." "That understood." Cecilia swallowed hard. "Yes, Mr. Miller. Perfectly." After he left, she sank onto the bed, relief washing over her. She had shelter, work, and relative anonymity, all she needed to catch her breath before deciding her next move. And if the suspicious glances of the townsfolk and the sheriff's two observant eyes were any indication, she would indeed be moving on before long. But for now, she had bought herself time. And time, Cecilia had learned, was the most valuable currency of all. She returned to town to collect her belongings from the hotel, explaining to a disappointed Mrs. Holloway that she'd found employment outside town. The older woman seemed genuinely sorry to lose the income, but offered Cecilia a wrapped package of biscuits for the journey. As Cecilia was tying her bags to her saddle, she felt that familiar prickling sensation at the back of her neck. She turned slowly, scanning the street, and found Sheriff Garrison watching her from the doorway of the general store. He approached with the same unhurried confidence she'd noticed earlier. "I see you took my advice about the Miller place. Word travels fast in Mineral Point. It's the only excitement we get most days." His smile was gentle, but his eyes missed nothing. "Will you be staying on at the ranch, then?" Cecilia adjusted her bonnet. "For a time, Mr. Miller has offered me the housekeeper position." "Good. He needs the help." Garrison hesitated, then added, "If you're planning to ride back alone, I'd be happy to accompany you. I need to speak with Miller about some strays his hands found." The offer seemed innocent enough, but Cecilia had learned to distrust coincidences. Still, refusing might attract more attention than accepting. "That's very kind," she said, keeping her voice neutral, "if it's not out of your way." They rode side by side along the dusty road, Garrison maintaining a respectful distance while pointing out landmarks and sharing bits of local history. Despite her wariness, Cecilia found herself relaxing slightly in his company. There was something reassuring about his steady presence. "How long have you been sheriff?" she asked, breaking a comfortable silence. 4 years now, came here after the war looking for somewhere quieter than where I'd been. And did you find it? His smile held a hint of irony. Mostly. We have our share of trouble, drunken cowboys, claim jumpers, the occasional rustler, but nothing like what I saw back east. Cecilia's hands tightened on her reins. We're back east. St. Louis mostly. Spent some time in Chicago too before heading west. He glanced at her. You ever been to Chicago, Miss Turner? The question seemed casual, but Cecilia felt a chill run down her spine. Passed through once, she lied. Too crowded for my taste. Garrison nodded, his expression unreadable. It's a city of extremes. Great beauty and terrible darkness, often on the same street. They crested a hill, and the Silver Star Ranch came into view below. Cecilia was grateful for the distraction. It looks peaceful from here, she observed. Most places do from a distance. Garrison adjusted his hat. Miller's a good man, lost his way a bit when Eliza died, but he's finding his footing again. He paused. His son Xavier's more complicated, good rancher but carries old wounds that haven't healed right. Cecilia's head snapped toward him. His son's name is Xavier. That's right. Named after his grandfather. Garrison looked amused. Why do you ask? No reason, she said quickly. It's an unusual name, that's all. Well, we're two of a kind in that respect. Most folks around here call him X to avoid confusion. They were approaching the ranch house now, and Garrison slowed his horse. Just a word of advice, Miss Turner. X Miller takes time to warm up to strangers. Don't take it personal if he seems standoffish. Cecilia nodded her thanks, wondering what kind of household she was entering. As they dismounted in front of the barn, a tall figure emerged from the shadows. For a moment, Cecilia thought her eyes were playing tricks on her. The man looked remarkably like the sheriff, with the same broad shoulders and confident stride. But as he stepped into the sunlight, the differences became apparent. Where Sheriff Garrison's face was open and his manner approachable, Xavier Miller's features were harder, his expression guarded. A scar ran along his jawline, disappearing into the collar of his shirt, and his eyes, the same storm gray as the sheriff's, held none of the latter's warmth. He was younger than Garrison by a few years, perhaps 30 to the sheriff's mid-30s, but seemed to carry a weight that aged him. Sheriff, he acknowledged, his gaze shifting to Cecilia. This the new housekeeper, Miss Turner, meet Xavier Miller, Garrison said. Cecilia Turner. Miller nodded curtly. Father mentioned he'd hired someone. His eyes traveled over her in a swift, assessing glance that contained no hint of impropriety, but left Cecilia feeling as if he'd catalogued every detail about her. You're not what I expected. Before she could respond, he turned back to Garrison. You're here about those strays. Got a report from the Peterson place about some cattle with your brand. Thought you might want to send someone to check it out. The two men fell into conversation about ranch matters, effectively dismissing her. Cecilia took the opportunity to lead her mare to the water trough, giving the animal a chance to drink while she observed the ranch more carefully. Several cowboys were visible in the distance, moving cattle between pastures. Smoke rose from the chimney of the main house, and chickens scratched in a fenced yard nearby. It was peaceful, ordinary, exactly the sort of place that wouldn't draw attention. Yet Cecilia couldn't shake the feeling that she'd stepped into a situation more complicated than it appeared. The physical similarity between Sheriff Garrison and Xavier Miller was striking, yet neither had acknowledged it, and Miller's cool reception suggested he wasn't pleased about her presence. Miss Turner. Xavier Miller's voice startled her from her thoughts. He'd approached silently, moving with the natural stealth of someone accustomed to working with skittish animals. Sheriff's heading back to town. Father asked me to show you the house and explain your duties. Garrison tipped his hat to her as he mounted his horse. Good luck settling in, Miss Turner. I'm sure we'll meet again soon. Something in his tone made it sound less like a social pleasantry and more like a promise or a warning. As the sheriff rode away, Miller gestured for Cecilia to follow him to the house. Father's gone to check the north pasture. Won't be back till supper. His stride was long, forcing Cecilia to walk quickly to keep pace. House isn't complicated. Kitchen, dining room, and study downstairs. Bedrooms upstairs. Your room you've seen. He pushed open the front door, revealing an interior that spoke of both comfort and neglect. The furniture was solid and well made, but dust had gathered in corners and on shelves. Curtains hung unevenly at windows that needed washing, and the floor hadn't been properly swept in some time. "My mother kept this place spotless," Miller said, a hint of challenge in his voice. "Father expects the same." Cecilia surveyed the room, mentally calculating how long it would take to restore order. "I'll need to know your father's preferences for meals, and yours as well, and the schedule for the ranch hands meals." Miller seemed surprised by her businesslike response. "Cook serves the hands in the bunkhouse kitchen. You'll be responsible for the main house breakfast at dawn, dinner at noon, supper at 6. Father likes plain food, well prepared, nothing fancy." He led her to the kitchen, a spacious room with a large wood-burning stove and ample work surfaces. "Pantry's through there. Storeroom for preserved goods in the cellar. Water pump in the yard, though there's a smaller one here for the sink." Cecilia nodded, noting the state of the kitchen cleaner than the rest of the house, but still showing signs of bachelor living. "And laundry. Wash day is Monday, clotheslines behind the house. Iron in the utility room." Miller paused, studying her. "You've done this kind of work before?" The question held the same skepticism she'd heard from Mrs. Finch in town. Cecilia met his gaze steadily. "I'm a quick learner, Mr. Miller." "I won't disappoint your father." A flicker of something respect perhaps crossed his face. "See that you don't." He moved toward the door, then hesitated. "One more thing, Miss Turner. This is a working ranch. We rise early, work hard, and don't have time for complications. Whatever you're running from, keep it away from Silver Star." Cecilia felt the blood drain from her face. "I don't know what you mean." Miller's expression remained impassive. "Don't you?" "A woman traveling alone, taking the first job offered no matter how unsuitable, watching the road like she expects trouble to follow. I've seen your kind before." He stepped closer, his voice dropping. "I don't care about your past, but I care about this ranch and my father. If trouble comes looking for you here, I'll be the first thing it finds." "Understood." Cecilia lifted her chin, refusing to be intimidated despite the hammering of her heart. "Perfectly, Mr. Miller. Rest assured, I have no intention of bringing complications to your doorstep." He held her gaze for a long moment, then nodded once. "Good, I'll leave you to get acquainted with the kitchen. Supper's in 2 hours." After he left, Cecilia leaned against the counter, taking deep breaths to calm herself. Xavier Miller was dangerously perceptive, and she'd need to be more careful around him. But at least he seemed content to let her stay as long as she didn't cause problems. She rolled up her sleeves and set to work, grateful for the physical activity to distract from her thoughts. By the time the kitchen clock struck 6, she had prepared a simple but satisfying meal of roast beef, potatoes, and fresh bread she'd found in the pantry. The table was set, the dining room swept, and she had changed into her cleanest dress. Old Man Miller returned first, stamping dust from his boots on the porch. He sniffed appreciatively as he entered. "Smells like Eliza's cooking," he said, the highest compliment he could offer. He washed his hands at the kitchen pump and took his seat at the head of the table. Xavier arrived moments later, his shirt changed but his expression as guarded as before. He nodded to Cecilia as she served the food, his eyes registering surprise at the transformation of the dining room. The meal proceeded mostly in silence, broken occasionally by the elder Miller's questions about the day's ranch work. Cecilia remained standing, ready to refill plates or fetch anything needed, as was proper for a housekeeper. When both men had finished, she began clearing the dishes. "Sit down, girl," Old Man Miller said suddenly. "You've worked hard enough for your first day." Cecilia hesitated, glancing at Xavier, who showed no reaction. "Thank you, sir, but dishes can wait. Sit, have some coffee." Miller's tone made it clear this wasn't a request. She sat gingerly at the far end of the table, accepting the cup of coffee Xavier silently poured for her. The bitter liquid was strong and reviving after her long day. "Where'd you learn to cook like that?" the elder Miller asked. Cecilia sipped her coffee to buy time. "My mother taught me," she said finally, which was partially true. Her mother had insisted she learn the basics of household management, even if servants handled the actual work. She taught you well. Miller studied her over his own cup. You're not what I expected when the sheriff mentioned a woman looking for work. Got education, haven't you? Some, Cecilia admitted cautiously. Miller exchanged a glance with his son. Well, education's never wasted. Might be useful teaching the little ones their letters once they're old enough. Little ones? Cecilia asked, confused. The grandchildren I'm still waiting on, Miller said pointedly, earning a scowl from Xavier. Though at the rate this one's going, I'll be long in my grave before they arrive. Xavier pushed back from the table. If you're done embarrassing yourself, father, I've got accounts to review. He nodded stiffly to Cecilia. Supper was adequate, breakfast at 5. With that, he strode from the room, his footsteps echoing as he climbed the stairs. Old man Miller sighed. Don't mind him, war changed him, changed us all. He drained his coffee cup. You did good work today, Miss Turner. Keep it up and you'll have a place here as long as you want it. The words were kind, but Cecilia knew better than to believe in permanent sanctuary. Still, she smiled gratefully. Thank you, Mr. Miller. Later, after the dishes were washed and the kitchen set to rights, Cecilia retreated to her small room. She unpacked her few belongings, hiding her precious bundle of incriminating documents beneath a loose floorboard she discovered under the bed. Then she sat by the window, watching as the last light faded from the sky and stars appeared one by one in the distance. A coyote howled, the sound echoing across the empty spaces. Cecilia wrapped her arms around herself, feeling very far from the life she'd once known. But as she gazed at the vast Wyoming sky, she felt something she hadn't experienced in months, a tentative hope that perhaps, just perhaps, she might outrun her past after all. Dawn broke over the Silver Star Ranch in a spectacular display of gold and crimson that painted the mountains and set the dew-covered grass gleaming. Cecilia had risen well before first light, determined to prove her worth on her first full day. She had the stove lit, coffee brewing and biscuits baking by the time she heard movement upstairs. Xavier Miller descended first, dressed for a day's work in sturdy clothing, his expression as unreadable as it had been the previous evening. He paused in the kitchen doorway, clearly surprised to find breakfast nearly ready. Good morning, Mr. Miller, Cecilia said, keeping her tone professional as she placed a steaming cup of coffee on the table. Breakfast will be served in 5 minutes. He regarded her silently for a moment, then nodded once and took his seat, reaching for the newspaper that had been delivered the previous day. His father joined them shortly, looking more rested than he had the night before. By God, it smells like the old days in here, the elder Miller exclaimed, accepting his own cup of coffee with evident pleasure. You're up with the roosters, Miss Turner. I wanted to make a proper start, she replied, serving plates of eggs, bacon, and biscuits with gravy. She'd found everything she needed in the well-stocked pantry and had made mental notes about what would need replenishing soon. The men ate with the focused efficiency of those who viewed food as fuel rather than pleasure, though both emptied their plates and accepted seconds when offered. Cecilia ate quickly at the far end of the table, then rose to begin clearing away. I'll need to go into town for supplies later, she said, mentally reviewing her inventory of the kitchen. Is there anything specific you'd like me to purchase? Take the list from the kitchen drawer, old Miller said. Add whatever else you need. Xavier can drive you in the wagon when he goes to the bank. Xavier looked up from his newspaper with a frown. I wasn't planning to go to town today. Well, now you are, his father replied firmly. Can't expect Miss Turner to carry everything back on that mare of hers. Besides, you've been putting off talking to the banker about that south parcel. The younger Miller's jaw tightened, but he nodded curtly. Be ready by 10, he told Cecilia, rising from the table. I won't wait if you're late. After the men departed for their morning tasks, Cecilia set to work in earnest. She swept and dusted the downstairs rooms, washed the kitchen floor, and made a start on the neglected windows. The physical labor was unfamiliar, but not unwelcome. It kept her thoughts from dwelling on the past and gave her a sense of accomplishment as each room gradually regained its proper appearance. By mid-morning, she had changed into her second-best dress, a sage green cotton that brought out the amber flecks in her hazel eyes and pinned her hair neatly under her bonnet. The supply list, amended with her own careful additions, was tucked into her pocket along with the money old Miller had provided for purchases. Xavier was already seated in the wagon when she emerged from the house, his hands holding the reins of two sturdy draft horses. He didn't offer help as she climbed up beside him, but did wait until she was properly seated before setting the horses in motion. They traveled in silence for the first mile, the only sounds the creak of the wagon and the steady rhythm of hooves on the packed dirt road. Cecilia kept her gaze on the passing landscape, admiring the wild beauty of Wyoming Territory while maintaining a dignified distance from her taciturn companion. "You did good work in the house this morning," Xavier said suddenly, surprising her. "Father noticed." Cecilia glanced at him, but his eyes remained fixed on the road ahead. "Thank you, there's still much to be done. My mother kept everything in perfect order." There was no accusation in his tone, merely statement of fact. After she died, neither of us had the heart to maintain her standards. The admission seemed to cost him something, and Cecilia responded carefully. "Grief changes our priorities, but sometimes honoring someone means caring for what they loved." Xavier's hands tightened on the reins. "You speak as if from experience, Miss Turner." Cecilia looked away. "Everyone has lost someone, Mr. Miller." He made a noncommittal sound, and they lapsed into silence again. As they approached town, Cecilia became aware of a tension in Xavier's posture that hadn't been there during their ride through open country. "You don't care for town visits," she observed. His mouth quirked in what might have been the ghost of a smile. "That obvious? You seemed at peace on the ranch, here less so." Xavier glanced at her, genuine curiosity briefly replacing his guarded expression. "Perceptive of you." He guided the wagon down Mineral Point's Main Street, nodding to acquaintances but not stopping to chat. "Too many people here want things from me: information, commitments, attention. On the ranch, it's simpler." Cecilia understood that sentiment all too well. "Then I appreciate you making this journey for the sake of the household supplies. Would have had to come eventually." He pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the general store. "I have business at the bank. Meet me back here in 2 hours." Cecilia nodded and descended from the wagon, list in hand. The general store was busy with mid-morning shoppers, and she had to wait her turn at the counter. As the shopkeeper assembled her order, she became aware of curious glances from other customers, particularly a group of women examining fabric at a nearby table. "You're the new housekeeper at Silver Star," one of them said, approaching with a friendly smile. She was a plump woman in her 40s with kind eyes and a practical manner. "I'm Martha Wilson. My husband runs the hardware store down the street." "Cecilia Turner," she replied, shaking the offered hand. "Yes, I started yesterday." "Brave woman," another lady commented, joining them. She was taller and more elegantly dressed, with a shrewd gaze. "The Millers have gone through 3 housekeepers since Eliza passed. None lasted more than a fortnight." Cecilia raised her eyebrows. "Is that so? Mr. Miller didn't mention that." "Douglas is a good man," Martha said, "but he and that son of his aren't easy to live with, too wrapped up in their grief, if you ask me." "And Xavier's never been the same since he came back from the war," the elegant woman added. "Such a shame." "He was the most charming young man before he went east to fight." Martha nodded sadly. "We all thought he'd marry Josephine Peterson when he returned, but he barely spoke to her. Now she's married to the banker's son, and Xavier's still alone up at that ranch, brooding like something out of a penny dreadful." Cecilia listened with interest, filing away these bits of local history. "Mr. Miller Xavier, that seems dedicated to the ranch. I'm sure that keeps him occupied." "Too occupied?" Martha sniffed. "A man needs more than cattle and land. He needs family." She studied Cecilia with new interest. "You're unmarried, I take it?" Cecilia nearly laughed at the transparent matchmaking attempt. "A widow," she reminded her, the familiar lie coming smoothly. "Oh, my dear, how tragic." Martha patted her arm sympathetically. Well, there's no better place than Silver Star to begin again, and Xavier Miller may be difficult, but he's a good man underneath it all, his father too. Cecilia was saved from responding by the shopkeeper announcing her order was ready. She paid for the supplies and arranged to have them delivered to the wagon, then excused herself to visit the post office. She had no mail to send or receive, couldn't risk any communication that might be traced, but the errand gave her an opportunity to observe the town more carefully than she had on her arrival. Mineral Point was larger than it had first appeared, with several side streets branching off the main thoroughfare. In addition to the businesses she'd already noted, there was a small church, a schoolhouse, and what appeared to be a doctor's office. As she passed the jailhouse, Sheriff Garrison emerged, tipping his hat when he spotted her. "Miss Turner, settling in at Silver Star? Yes, thank you for the recommendation." Cecilia was uncomfortably aware that her conversation with Martha Wilson and her friend had likely already circulated through town. Small communities thrived on such exchanges of information. Glad to hear it. Garrison fell into step beside her. "I see X brought you to town." "He doesn't make the trip often, so I gather. He's attending to business at the bank." Garrison nodded, unsurprised. Douglas mentioned expanding the herd, probably securing the loan for that. He glanced at her curiously. "How are you finding life at Silver Star?" "Different from what you're accustomed to, I imagine." The comment could have been innocent, but Cecilia sensed an underlying probe. "Change can be refreshing, Sheriff, and hard work is its own reward. Indeed it is." They had reached the general store again, where Xavier was loading the last of her purchases into the wagon. "Afternoon, X," Garrison called. "Productive trip to town?" Xavier straightened, his expression cooling as he saw the sheriff. "Productive enough." He turned to Cecilia. "Everything on your list acquired?" "Yes, thank you." She nodded politely to Garrison. "Good day, Sheriff." As they pulled away from the store, Cecilia noticed the tension in Xavier's shoulders had increased. He handled the reins competently but with unnecessary force, as if channeling some inner frustration. "You and the sheriff seem familiar with each other," she ventured after they'd left the town behind. Xavier's jaw tightened. "Small town, everyone knows everyone. Yet you don't care for him." He shot her a sharp glance. "You ask a lot of questions for a housekeeper." Cecilia refused to be intimidated. "Observation isn't the same as questioning, Mr. Miller, and understanding the household I serve helps me perform my duties better." For a moment she thought he might rebuke her for impertinence. Instead, after a long pause, he sighed. "Garrison and I served in the same regiment. We see things differently now." It was a sparse explanation, but more than she'd expected. "The war changed many perspectives," she offered. Xavier's hands flexed on the reins. "The war just revealed what was already there beneath the surface." He glanced at her, his expression unreadable, like most things in life. Cecilia wondered if the comment was directed at her, a reminder that he suspected she wasn't what she claimed to be. But his gaze had already returned to the road, and the remainder of their journey passed in silence. Back at the ranch, Xavier helped unload the supplies before disappearing toward the pastures where the hands were working. Old Miller appeared as Cecilia was organizing the pantry, nodding approvingly at her purchases. "Good selections," he said, examining a sack of flour. "Saw you met Martha Wilson in town. She mention anything interesting?" Cecilia looked up, surprised by the question. "She was very welcoming. Introduced me to another lady, I didn't catch her name." "Tall woman, expensive dress, looks like she's smelled something unpleasant." "That's the one," Miller chuckled. "Adelaide Harrington, fancies herself the social arbiter of Mineral Point. Always trying to pair Xavier off with some suitable young lady." He shook his head. "As if my son would be interested in the simpering girls she approves of." Cecilia arranged jars of preserves on a shelf. "Mrs. Wilson mentioned something about a Josephine Peterson." Miller's expression sobered. "Ah, that's a wound still tender. Josephine and Xavier were sweet on each other before the war. Everyone expected them to marry when he returned." He sighed heavily. "But the man who came home wasn't the boy who left. Josephine waited 2 years, then married Thomas Reynolds. Can't blame her, really. Life goes on, and Xavier never." Cecilia trailed off, aware she was prying into personal matters. Never looked at another woman seriously, Miller shrugged. Plenty have shown interest. He's not blind to it, just hasn't found anyone who understands what he's been through, I reckon. He studied Cecilia thoughtfully. You're different from the other housekeepers we've had, more substantial somehow. Cecilia focused on her task, uncomfortable with his scrutiny. I'm just doing the job I was hired for, Mr. Miller. Of course. He patted her shoulder awkwardly. And doing it well. Keep it up, Miss Turner. As the first week passed, Cecilia settled into a rhythm at Silver Star. She rose before dawn each day to prepare breakfast, spent mornings on household tasks, afternoons on laundry or baking, and evenings serving dinner and tidying up afterward. The work was physically demanding but straightforward, and she found satisfaction in restoring order to the neglected house. Old Miller was openly appreciative of her efforts, commenting favorably on each improvement and bringing her wildflowers he'd picked during his daily rides. Xavier remained more reserved, but his initial suspicions seemed to have eased somewhat. He began to acknowledge her work with brief nods or the occasional "well done," which, according to the ranch hands, constituted high praise from the taciturn rancher. Cecilia was careful to maintain appropriate distance and formality with both men, but she couldn't help noticing Xavier more than was strictly necessary for her position. There was something compelling about his quiet strength and the complexity she glimpsed beneath his controlled exterior. She observed how gentle he was with injured animals, how patient with the youngest ranch hand who was still learning the trade, how devoted to his father despite their occasional clashes. On her second Sunday afternoon off, Cecilia rode her mare along a stream that ran through the eastern part of the ranch property. The day was warm but pleasant, with a gentle breeze carrying the scent of wildflowers and sage. She had brought a book, one of the few possessions she'd taken from Chicago, and found a shady spot beneath a cottonwood tree where she could read undisturbed. Or so she thought. Most people in these parts consider Sunday a day of rest. Xavier's voice came from behind her, startling her so badly she dropped her book. Mr. Miller, I didn't hear you approach. She scrambled to her feet, brushing grass from her skirt. Didn't mean to frighten you. He dismounted from his horse, a magnificent black stallion that regarded Cecilia with intelligent eyes. Father mentioned you'd ridden this way, wanted to make sure you hadn't gotten lost. That was thoughtful of him, but I'm fine, as you can see. Cecilia bent to retrieve her book, but Xavier was faster, picking it up and examining the cover. Emerson, not what I'd expect a housekeeper to be reading in her spare time. His tone wasn't accusatory, merely curious. Cecilia accepted the book from him. I enjoy his thoughts on self-reliance. Seems appropriate for life out west. Xavier studied her with new interest. You're an unusual woman, Miss Turner. I'll choose to take that as a compliment, Mr. Miller. The corner of his mouth lifted in what might almost have been a smile. It was intended as one. He glanced at the stream, then back at her. Since you're not lost, perhaps you'd permit me to show you something. A place on the property few people know about. Cecilia hesitated. Spending time alone with Xavier wasn't wise, not when she was trying to maintain professional boundaries, and certainly not when part of her was inexplicably drawn to him despite all her cautious instincts. It's not far, he added, misinterpreting her hesitation. And you'd be back well before supper. Very well, she found herself saying. I'd be honored. They mounted their horses, Xavier leading the way upstream. The path followed the water for about a mile before veering up a rocky slope that Cecilia wouldn't have noticed on her own. As they climbed, the vegetation changed, pine trees replacing cottonwoods and the air growing cooler. Almost there, Xavier said over his shoulder. Just beyond these rocks. They emerged suddenly into a hidden valley so unexpected and beautiful that Cecilia gasped aloud. A small lake, impossibly blue, reflected the surrounding mountains and sky. Wildflowers carpeted the ground in a riot of colors, and a waterfall tumbled down the far cliff face, feeding the lake with crystalline water. It's magnificent, she breathed, dismounting to better appreciate the view. Xavier tied their horses to a pine tree and came to stand beside her. My mother showed me this place when I was a boy, said it was where she came when she needed to remember that the world held more beauty than hardship. His voice was softer than she'd ever heard it. I've never brought anyone else here. Cecilia looked up at him, surprised by the admission. Why show me? His eyes met hers, and for once his expression was unguarded. Because you see things others miss, and because you carry your own burdens without complaint. Thought you might appreciate a place like this. The simple honesty of his words touched her deeply. Thank you, it's a gift I'll treasure. They stood in companionable silence, watching an eagle soar overhead. Cecilia was acutely aware of Xavier beside her, the solid presence of him, the clean scent of soap and leather, the careful distance he maintained between them. You're good for the ranch, he said suddenly. For my father, he smiles more since you came. He's a kind employer, Cecilia replied. I'm grateful for the position. Is that all it is to you? A position? The question held layers she wasn't prepared to explore. What else could it be, Mr. Miller? Xavier studied her face. I think you know. He took a step closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of blue in his gray eyes. I've watched you these past weeks, Cecilia. You're hiding something that frightens you, but underneath that fear there's strength, integrity. His voice dropped lower. And a loneliness that matches my own. Cecilia's heart pounded in her chest. You're mistaken, she whispered, but the denial sounded hollow even to her own ears. Am I? His hand rose, hesitated, then gently brushed a strand of hair from her face. The touch was feather-light, respectful, but it sent warmth cascading through her. I don't think so. For one breathless moment, Cecilia thought he might kiss her, part of her a reckless, yearning part she'd thought long suppressed wanted him to. But Xavier stepped back, his expression once more carefully composed. We should head back, he said, his voice returning to its usual measured tone. Storm clouds gathering to the west. The ride back to the ranch was quiet, each lost in their own thoughts. As they approached the house, Cecilia was surprised to see a carriage in the yard that hadn't been there when they left. A sleek black buggy with a matched pair of bay horses, the conveyance of someone with money and taste. Xavier stiffened in his saddle. What the hell is he doing here? Who? Cecilia asked, but Xavier was already spurring his horse forward, leaving her to follow at a more sedate pace. By the time she reached the yard, Xavier had dismounted and was striding toward the house, his shoulders rigid with tension. As Cecilia tied her mare to the hitching post, the front door opened and 3 people emerged, Old Man Miller, Sheriff Garrison, and a well-dressed gentleman she didn't recognize. Ah, there he is, the stranger said, his cultured voice carrying across the yard. Xavier Miller, as taciturn as ever. And this must be the new housekeeper I've heard so much about. Cecilia approached cautiously, noting the way both Millers had tensed at the man's arrival. Sheriff Garrison stood slightly apart, his expression watchful. Miss Turner, this is James Blackburn, Old Miller said stiffly. A business associate from Chicago. The name meant nothing to Cecilia, but the mention of Chicago sent a chill through her. She curtsied slightly, keeping her eyes lowered. Sir? Charming, Blackburn remarked. Quite charming indeed. You found a gem, Miller. He was perhaps 50, expensively dressed, with silver-streaked dark hair and shrewd eyes that missed nothing. Though I confess I'm surprised to find someone of Miss Turner's quality in such a remote location. Mr. Blackburn is here to discuss cattle prices, Xavier cut in, his tone making it clear the visit was unwelcome. A matter that doesn't require the presence of our housekeeper. Cecilia recognized the dismissal for the protection it was. Of course, I'll prepare supper. Will Mr. Blackburn be joining us? Unfortunately not, Blackburn answered before either Miller could speak. I must return to town tonight, business calls. His gaze lingered on Cecilia a moment too long. Though I do hope we'll meet again, Miss Turner, I find you intriguing. Cecilia murmured something non-committal and escaped to the kitchen, her heart racing. There had been something predatory in Blackburn's assessment, something that awakened old fears. Once inside, she pressed her back against the door, taking deep breaths to calm herself. Through the window, she could see the men still talking in the yard. Sheriff Garrison said something that made Blackburn laugh, but neither Miller appeared amused. Xavier's stance was almost confrontational, while his father seemed to be trying to maintain a semblance of politeness. Eventually, Blackburn returned to his carriage, the sheriff accompanying him. Xavier and his father remained in the yard, deep in conversation that appeared increasingly heated. Cecilia busied herself with meal preparations, trying not to watch the family drama unfolding outside. When the men finally entered the house, the tension between them was palpable. Old Miller headed straight for his study while Xavier paused in the kitchen doorway. "Is everything all right?" Cecilia asked, unable to contain her concern. Xavier's expression was grim. "Blackburn wants to buy the south pasture, offering twice what it's worth." "That seems generous, too generous." Xavier's eyes narrowed. "He doesn't care about cattle. Rumor is he's working for the railroad, buying up land for a new line they want to put through. And your father?" "Considering the offer." Xavier ran a hand through his hair, a rare gesture of frustration. "That land's been in our family for 3 generations. I don't care what price he's offering, some things shouldn't be sold." Cecilia nodded, understanding the sentiment all too well. "Your father values your opinion. I'm sure he'll make the right decision. Hope you're right." Xavier studied her for a moment. "Blackburn seemed interested in you. You ever seen him before?" The question was casual, but Cecilia sensed the importance of her answer. "No, never." At least that much was true. Though he said he was from Chicago, yes, one of many reasons to distrust him. Xavier's tone suggested personal knowledge rather than general prejudice. "If he approaches you when I'm not around, be careful what you say." Man has a way of using information to his advantage. With that cryptic warning, he left her to finish preparing the evening meal. Cecilia worked mechanically, her thoughts racing. A man from Chicago with apparent wealth and influence, suddenly appearing in Mineral Point just weeks after her arrival. It could be coincidence, but Cecilia had learned not to believe in such things. Had her father somehow tracked her here? Was Blackburn one of his agents, sent to locate her and the damning evidence she'd taken? The thought sent a wave of panic through her so strong that she nearly dropped the pot she was holding. She needed to be ready to flee again. Tonight, perhaps, while both Millers slept. She had enough money saved for a train ticket south, and her mare could carry her to the next town where she wouldn't be recognized. But even as she formulated an escape plan, Cecilia felt a profound reluctance she hadn't experienced in her previous flights. In just a few weeks, Silver Star had begun to feel like home. Old Miller treated her with a fatherly kindness she'd never known from Edward Vaughn and Xavier. Xavier saw her in ways no one ever had before. Leaving would mean abandoning the tentative connections she'd formed here. It would mean never seeing the hidden valley again, never experiencing where that moment with Xavier might have led if circumstances had been different. But staying could put them all in danger. If her father discovered where she was and who had sheltered her, there would be consequences. Edward Vaughn did not forgive those who interfered with his plans, especially when family honor was at stake. Dinner that evening was a subdued affair. Old Miller ate silently, his weathered face creased with worry. Xavier barely touched his food, his attention focused on his father's distraction. Cecilia served efficiently, her own appetite gone. "Miss Turner," Old Miller said suddenly, "you're from back east. What do you know about railroads?" Cecilia nearly dropped the serving dish. "Sir, railroads, progress, the changing face of the West." Miller waved his fork expressively. "Good thing or bad, honest opinion." She chose her words carefully. "Progress isn't inherently good or bad, Mr. Miller. It depends on who controls it and to what end." She thought of her father's railroad investments, the bribes paid to politicians, the small farmers forced off their land. "Some men use progress as a shield for greed." Xavier looked up, something like approval in his eyes. "Well said." Old Miller nodded thoughtfully. "Blackburn says the railroad would bring prosperity to Mineral Point, more buyers for our cattle, higher prices for land." "Perhaps," Cecilia acknowledged, "but at what cost? Once you sell, you lose control over what happens next." "Exactly what I've been saying," Xavier muttered. "I haven't decided anything," his father said defensively, "just considering options." The discussion continued after dinner, father and son retreating to the study while Cecilia cleaned the kitchen. Their voices rose and fell, occasionally sharp enough for her to catch fragments of argument. Xavier's deep voice insisting, "Can't trust Blackburn, and once it starts, we can't stop it," contrasted with his father's more measured tones asking, "What about the future?" and "Can't stand in the way of time." By the time Cecilia had finished her tasks and retired to her room, the house had fallen silent. She sat on her bed, considering her options. If she left now, she might avoid whatever complications Blackburn's arrival portended. But fleeing would mean starting over yet again, in a place where she had no connections and no protection. And there was Xavier. The memory of his hand brushing her cheek, the understanding in his eyes when he'd said she carried her own burdens. Could she really leave without knowing what might have grown between them? A soft knock on her door startled her from her thoughts. "Miss Turner," Xavier's voice pitched low. "May I have a word?" Cecilia hesitated, then rose to open the door. Xavier stood in the hallway, a lamp in his hand casting shadows across his face. "Is something wrong?" "Not here," he said quietly. "Can you come outside? There's something you should know." Curiosity overcame caution. Cecilia fetched her shawl and followed Xavier through the silent house and out onto the porch. The night was clear, stars scattered across the sky like diamonds on black velvet. A three-quarter moon provided enough light to see by once their eyes adjusted. Xavier set his lamp on the porch railing and leaned against a post, his face half in shadow. "My father's going to sell," he said without preamble. "Not just the south pasture, the whole ranch," Cecilia gasped, "but it's been in your family for generations, 3 generations. My grandfather built this house." Xavier's voice was tight with controlled anger. "But Blackburn made an offer father can't refuse, triple the market value plus a position managing the new stockyard they'll build in town." He laughed bitterly. "Set for life," he says. "No more worrying about drought or disease or winter freeze." "What about you?" Cecilia asked softly. "Surely your wishes matter too," Xavier shrugged, the gesture deceptively casual. "Father's the legal owner, his decision to make. But this is your home too, your heritage. Which is why I'm telling you this tonight." He turned to face her fully, his expression grave. "I won't stay, Cecilia. When the papers are signed, I'm heading west, Oregon, maybe, or California. Somewhere I can start fresh, away from railroads in progress and men like Blackburn." He paused, his gaze intense. "I want you to come with me." Cecilia stared at him, certain she'd misunderstood. "Mr. Miller, Xavier," he corrected. "After what I'm proposing, I think we're beyond formalities." "What exactly are you proposing?" she asked carefully. He took a step closer. "I'm asking you to come with me, not as my housekeeper, as my wife." The word hung in the night air between them, impossible and alluring all at once. "Your wife," Cecilia repeated faintly, "but you barely know me." "I know enough." His voice softened. "I know you work hard and take pride in what you do. I know you're educated and thoughtful. I know you understand loss and fear and starting over." He reached for her hand, his touch gentle but sure. "And I know that when I'm with you, I feel something I haven't felt since before the war, hope." Cecilia's heart raced, torn between longing and terror. "Xavier, I am not who you think I am. You mean you're not really a widow?" His smile was surprisingly tender. "I suspected as much from the beginning. It's more complicated than that." She withdrew her hand reluctantly. "There are things about my past that would endanger anyone connected to me, things I can't explain." "You don't have to explain, not now, not ever, if that's your choice." Xavier's eyes held her steadily. "We all have pasts we'd rather forget. Mine includes things I've done that would horrify you. But it's not our pasts that matter, it's what we choose now, today." His words touched something deep within her, a yearning for connection she'd denied for so long. "I can't ask you to take such a risk. You're not asking, I'm offering." He took her hand again, more firmly this time. "Whatever you're running from, Cecilia, we can face it together. I'm not a man who frightens easily." Tears welled in her eyes. "You don't understand. My father is a powerful man who will stop at nothing to find you." Xavier nodded as she gasped in surprise. Sheriff Garrison did some investigating after you arrived. Nothing specific, just confirmed you weren't who you claimed to be. Cecilia tried to pull away, but Xavier held fast. You knew, all this time, knew you were hiding something significant, didn't know what. His expression remained gentle despite the firmness of his grip. Didn't need to know. What matters is who you are now, not who you were running from. And if he finds me, finds us, Xavier's smile held a dangerous edge, then he'll discover what happens when someone threatens what's mine. He released her hand and stepped back slightly. But I understand if you prefer to keep running alone. It's your choice, Cecilia. I won't force your hand. The offer hung between them, tempting and terrifying in equal measure. To be Xavier Miller's wife, to build a new life far from Chicago and her father's reach, to have someone to share her burdens with after so long alone. The longing nearly overwhelmed her, but the rational part of her mind reminded her of the risks. Edward Vaughn had connections across the country. His reach was long, his memory unforgiving, and Xavier, for all his quiet strength, had no idea what kind of enemy he would be making. I need time, she said finally. To think, to be certain. Xavier nodded, unsurprised. Of course, take all the time you need. He hesitated, then added softly, but not too long. Father's meeting Blackburn tomorrow to discuss terms. Once that's done, things will move quickly. He turned to go, then paused, looking back at her. For a moment, Cecilia thought he might say something more. Instead, he simply nodded once and disappeared into the house, leaving her alone with the stars and an impossible choice. Sleep eluded Cecilia that night. She paced her small room, weighing options, calculating risks, imagining futures. The practical side of her insisted that accepting Xavier's proposal was madness. She barely knew him, despite the connection she felt. And bringing her troubles to his doorstep would be selfish and dangerous. Yet there was something about Xavier Miller that inspired trust. He had seen through her facade from the beginning, but had respected her privacy. He had shared his special place with her, revealed his vulnerability, offered partnership without demands. And then there was the undeniable truth she'd been avoiding. She was falling in love with him. With his quiet strength and hidden gentleness, with his devotion to the land and his principles. With the way he saw her, really saw her when so many others looked right through, dawn found her still awake, but with clarity at last. She would tell Xavier everything about her father, about the evidence she carried, about the danger that followed her. If, knowing all that, he still wanted her by his side, then perhaps it was worth the risk. She rose and dressed mechanically, her mind focused on what she would say to Xavier when they had a moment alone. But as she entered the kitchen to begin breakfast preparations, she found old Miller already there, a cup of coffee in his hand and a troubled expression on his face. Mr. Miller. Is everything all right? He looked up, startled from his thoughts. Miss Turner, didn't hear you come in, he sighed heavily. No, I suppose everything is not all right. Xavier's gone. Cecilia felt the blood drain from her face. Gone? Where? Left before first light. Left this for you. He held out a folded piece of paper. Said to tell you he'll wait 3 days at Fort Bridger. After that, he's heading west whether you join him or not. With trembling fingers, Cecilia accepted the note. Inside, Xavier's strong handwriting filled the page. Cecilia, I realize I've asked you to take an impossible leap of faith. It's unfair to demand an answer without giving you the whole truth about myself first. So here it is. I was a different man before the war, optimistic, trusting. The kind of man who believed in a future with Josephine Peterson and children running around Silver Star. The war changed that. I saw and did things that haunt me still. When I returned, I couldn't bear to taint Josephine with what I'd become, so I pushed her away. Buried myself in ranch work. Existed rather than lived. Then you arrived, running from your own demons, and I recognized something in you that matched what was in me, a determination to survive despite everything. You brought life back to Silver Star and to me. I understand if you can't trust me with your secrets yet. Trust takes time, but I'm offering you a chance at a new beginning somewhere no one knows either of us, where we can build something honest together. I'll wait for you at Fort Bridger for 3 days. If you don't come, I'll understand. But know this, Whatever haunts you, whatever you're running from, I would face it with you if you'd let me. Cecilia read the letter twice, her heart pounding. Xavier had left without saying goodbye, without hearing her decision. Had her hesitation pushed him away? Or was this his way of giving her true freedom to choose? He's a stubborn one, my son, old Miller said, watching her reaction. Always has been, gets that from his mother. He smiled sadly. But he's never written a letter like that to any woman, far as I know. Mr. Miller, Cecilia began, unsure what to say. He held up a hand. Don't need to explain to me, Miss Turner. I've seen how he looks at you and how you look at him when you think nobody's watching. He took a sip of coffee. Life's too short for regrets. That's what I'm realizing now, thinking about selling this place. Are you really going to sell to Blackburn? Cecilia asked, momentarily distracted from her own dilemma. Miller's expression hardened. Got no choice, really. Ranch this size needs a younger man to run it properly, and Xavier's made it clear he won't stay if I sell even part of it. Might as well take the good offer while it's there. He studied her face. Unless there's some reason I shouldn't trust Blackburn, Cecilia hesitated. I don't know Mr. Blackburn personally, she said carefully. But in my experience, when an offer seems too good to be true, it usually is. Miller nodded thoughtfully. You know, Xavier said almost the same thing. He rose from the table. Well, I've got a meeting in town with Blackburn at noon, supposed to be signing preliminary papers. He headed for the door, then paused. Fort Bridger's 2 days' hard ride from here. If someone were planning to meet my son there, they'd want to leave soon. After he left, Cecilia stood motionless in the kitchen, Xavier's letter clutched in her hand. The decision that had seemed so clear in the pre-dawn hours now wavered. Xavier had departed without hearing her explanation, leaving her only the option to follow or stay behind. It felt like another test, another demand for trust she wasn't sure she could give, and yet. The thought of never seeing him again created an ache so profound she could barely breathe. She was still standing there when hoofbeats in the yard announced a visitor. Moving to the window, she was surprised to see Sheriff Garrison dismounting from his horse. He caught sight of her and touched his hat in greeting before heading for the porch. Cecilia met him at the door, wary of his unexpected appearance. Sheriff, Mr. Miller has gone to town for a meeting. I know, I'm not here to see Douglas. Garrison's expression was uncharacteristically serious. May I come in, Miss Turner, or should I say Miss Vaughn? The name hit her like a physical blow. Cecilia stepped back involuntarily, her hand going to the kitchen knife on the nearby table. How did you easy now? Garrison raised his hands, showing he was unarmed. I'm not here to cause you trouble, quite the opposite. You know who I am, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Does that mean your father doesn't know you're here, at least not yet? Garrison remained in the doorway, making no move to enter without permission. But Blackburn is more than he appears to be, and he's asking questions about you in town. Cecilia's mind raced. You know about my father, about what he does. I was a policeman in Chicago before the war, Garrison confirmed. Edward Vaughn's reputation was well known among law enforcement, even if we could never touch him. His expression softened slightly. When a young woman matching his daughter's description arrived in my town, traveling alone and clearly afraid, I made some inquiries. And now you've come to take me back, Cecilia concluded bitterly. How much is he paying you? Garrison's face registered genuine shock. I'm not here to take you anywhere, Miss Vaughn. I'm here to warn you. He glanced over his shoulder, then back at her. May I please come inside? This conversation shouldn't happen where anyone passing might hear. After a moment's hesitation, Cecilia stepped aside. Garrison entered, removing his hat and placing it on the table. He remained standing, maintaining a respectful distance. Blackburn works for your father, he said without preamble. Not directly, there are layers of separation, but the connection is there. He arrived in Mineral Point 3 days ago, asking casual questions about newcomers to the area. And you told him about me, Cecilia accused. I told him nothing, Garrison replied firmly. But Martha Wilson mentioned the new housekeeper at Silver Star, and Adelaide Harrington added that you were a handsome young widow from back east. Blackburn's interest was immediate. Cecilia sank into a chair, her legs suddenly unsteady. So he suspects. He's coming here today. Ostensibly to finalize the land purchase with Douglas, but I believe his real purpose is to confirm your identity. Garrison's gaze was direct. If he does, your father's men won't be far behind. Why are you telling me this? Cecilia asked, studying his face for any sign of deception. You're a lawman. Why help me? Garrison sighed, running a hand through his hair in a gesture reminiscent of Xavier. Because some laws protect the wrong people, because I've seen what men like your father do to those who stand in their way. He paused. And because Xavier Miller is the closest thing to a brother I have, despite our differences. You and Xavier. Cecilia began, suddenly making connections. You look alike, are you, half-brothers, same father, different mothers? Garrison's smile was wry. My mother was Douglas's first wife. She died when I was an infant, and he remarried Xavier's mother a year later, raised us together until I was 18 and headed east for work. Does Xavier know you're here? Cecilia asked, thinking of the letter in her pocket. No, and he wouldn't thank me for interfering if he did. Garrison checked his pocket watch. Blackburn will be at the ranch within the hour. You need to decide quickly what you're going to do. The moment of choice had arrived sooner than she'd expected. Cecilia touched Xavier's letter through the fabric of her dress, feeling as if she stood at a crossroads with no clear path forward. What would you do? She asked Garrison softly. If you were me, he considered the question seriously. I'd go to Fort Bridger, he said finally. Not because it's the safest choice, it probably isn't, but because Xavier Miller is the best man I know, and he deserves happiness after everything he's been through. He met her gaze directly, and because I think you might be exactly what he needs, even though I'll bring danger to his doorstep. X can handle danger. Garrison's confidence was absolute. What he can't handle is losing someone else he cares about. The pieces fell into place suddenly. Xavier's reluctance to trust, his withdrawal from Josephine after the war, his wariness around his half-brother. He had experienced too many losses already, and now she faced a choice. Add to those losses by disappearing or risk everything on the chance that together they might find a way forward. Thank you, Sheriff, she said, rising from the chair with new determination. I know what I need to do. Garrison nodded, replacing his hat. I'll delay Blackburn as long as I can, give you time to get clear. He paused at the door. If you do go to Xavier, tell him I said he's lucky to have found someone who understands the value of courage. After he left, Cecilia moved swiftly. She packed her few belongings, retrieved the hidden documents from beneath the floorboard, and wrote a brief note to Old Man Miller explaining her sudden departure. She saddled her mare and loaded her packs, then took one last look at the house that had briefly been her home. Part of her wanted to wait for old Miller's return to say a proper goodbye to the man who had shown her kindness when she needed it most. But time was her enemy now. If Blackburn confirmed his suspicions, her father's reach would extend to Mineral Point within days. As she mounted her horse and turned west, Cecilia felt a curious mixture of fear and exhilaration. For the first time since fleeing Chicago, she wasn't just running from something, she was running toward something. Toward Xavier. Toward a future that, while uncertain, held the promise of companionship and understanding she'd never thought possible. The road to Fort Bridger stretched before her, a thin line cutting through vast open country. 2 days of hard riding lay ahead, with all the risks that entailed for a woman traveling alone. But Cecilia Vaughn had survived worse. And this time, she had something worth fighting for waiting at the journey's end. Fort Bridger appeared on the horizon late on the second day, just as Cecilia was beginning to fear she'd somehow missed it in the vast Wyoming landscape. The military outpost sat on a plateau surrounded by rolling hills, its walls and buildings visible for miles. As she approached, Cecilia could make out soldiers patrolling the perimeter and civilians moving about the small settlement that had grown up around the fort. She was exhausted, her body aching from 2 days of hard riding with minimal rest. Dust covered her clothes and her hair had come loose from its pins, hanging in tangled strands around her face. She must look a fright, she thought, suddenly self-conscious at the prospect of seeing Xavier again, At the fort's main gate, a young soldier stopped her. "State your business, madam." "I'm looking for someone," Cecilia replied, her voice hoarse from disuse. "Xavier Miller, he said he would be here." The soldier's expression brightened with recognition. "The tall fellow with the black stallion arrived yesterday, said he was waiting for someone." He gestured toward the cluster of buildings inside the fort. "Try the trading post, he's been spending time there." Cecilia thanked him and rode through the gate, her heart pounding harder with each step her mare took. What if Xavier had changed his mind? What if her appearance, dusty, disheveled, exhausted, shocked him into reconsidering his proposal? What if she stopped herself mid-thought? These fears were pointless. Xavier had seen her at her most vulnerable and had still wanted her by his side. Either he meant what he'd written in his letter, or he didn't. Only one way to find out. The trading post was busy with soldiers and travelers purchasing supplies. Cecilia dismounted stiffly, tying her mare to a hitching post and pausing to straighten her dress and tuck her hair back as best she could. Then, taking a deep breath, she stepped inside. The interior was dim after the bright sunlight, and it took a moment for her eyes to adjust. The space was crowded with barrels, shelves, and people examining goods. She scanned faces, looking for the one that had become so dear to her in such a short time, Cecilia. The voice came from behind her, deep and familiar and holding a note of something that might have been wonder. She turned slowly, and there he was, Xavier Miller, standing in the doorway she had just entered, silhouetted against the afternoon light. For a moment, neither moved. Then Xavier crossed the distance between them in 3 long strides and stopped just short of touching her, his eyes searching her face. "You came," he said simply. Cecilia nodded, suddenly unable to form words past the lump in her throat. Now that she was here, face to face with him, all the careful explanations she'd rehearsed during her journey fled her mind. Xavier reached out, his fingers gently brushing a smudge of dust from her cheek. "You look exhausted. When did you leave Silver Star?" "The morning after you did," she managed. "I've been riding since." Concern replaced wonder in his expression. 2 days with barely any rest. You could have waited another day." "No," Cecilia said, finding her voice at last. "I couldn't. Blackburn works for my father. He was coming to the ranch to confirm who I am." Xavier's face hardened. "Garrison told you this?" "Yes, he came to warn me." She hesitated, then added, "He said to tell you that you're lucky to have found someone who understands the value of courage." A complex series of emotions crossed Xavier's face: surprise, suspicion, and finally, a reluctant understanding. "Sounds like my brother," he muttered. Then, more loudly, "Come on, you need rest and food before we talk further." He led her outside, where his black stallion was now tied beside her mare. Taking the reins of both animals, he guided them toward a small building at the edge of the fort's interior. "Guest quarters," he explained. "Not fancy, but clean. I've taken one room and there's another available next door." The room was indeed basic: a narrow bed, a washstand, a small table, and a single chair, but to Cecilia's weary eyes, it looked like paradise. Xavier deposited her saddlebags on the floor and turned to leave. "Rest," he said. "I'll bring food. We can talk when you're ready." "Xavier," Cecilia called before he could exit. He paused, looking back at her. "Thank you for waiting." The corner of his mouth lifted in that almost smile she'd come to cherish. "I would have waited longer." After he left, Cecilia sank onto the bed, too tired even to remove her boots. But rest eluded her despite her exhaustion. Her mind raced with all that had happened, all that might still happen. She had found Xavier, but their journey was just beginning. Eventually, she roused herself enough to wash away the dust of travel and change into her cleanest dress. She brushed her hair until it shone and pinned it in a simple style that softened her features. Not vanity, she told herself, but practicality. The conversation ahead would be difficult enough without looking like she'd been dragged behind her horse. A knock at the door announced Xavier's return. He entered bearing a tray laden with food, bread, cheese, dried fruit, and a steaming pot of coffee. "Thought you might prefer privacy to the mess hall," he said, setting the tray on the table. Cecilia smiled gratefully. "You thought correctly." They ate in companionable silence, Xavier clearly understanding her need for sustenance before serious discussion. The simple food tasted better than any fine dinner she'd had in Chicago, enhanced by hunger and the company. When she'd eaten her fill, Xavier poured more coffee and settled in the chair across from her. "Now," he said quietly, "tell me everything," and so she did. Starting with her discovery of documents in her father's study that detailed bribes, threats, and worse. How she'd confronted him, believing naively that he would be ashamed and make amends. The look in Edward Vaughn's eyes when he'd realized his own daughter could destroy him. The warning from her father's secretary, who had always been kind to her, that men had been instructed to handle the situation. Her flight from the only home she'd ever known, with nothing but a few belongings and the damning evidence she couldn't bring herself to destroy. Xavier listened without interruption, his expression growing darker as the tale unfolded. When she described the bullet that had grazed her shoulder outside St. Louis, his hands tightened on the arms of his chair, but he remained silent. "I've been running ever since," she concluded. "Changing names, never staying in one place long enough to be found, until Mineral Point." She looked down at her hands. "Until you." Xavier was quiet for a long moment, absorbing everything she'd shared. "These documents," he said finally. "You still have them," Cecilia nodded. "Hidden in my belongings. They're my only insurance. If something happens to me, I've arranged for them to be delivered to newspapers in Chicago and New York." "Smart," Xavier acknowledged, "but dangerous to keep them with you. More dangerous to be without them," she countered. "My father won't stop looking as long as they exist." Xavier leaned forward, his eyes intent on hers. "So we have two problems, keeping you safe and dealing with these documents in a way that removes the target from your back." He spoke with such calm determination that Cecilia felt her anxiety easing slightly. "You still want to help me?" she asked. "Even knowing what you'd be facing?" "I want to marry you," he corrected. "Help comes with that territory." His expression softened. "Nothing you've told me changes what I wrote in that letter, Cecilia. I meant every word." Tears welled in her eyes. "I don't deserve such loyalty." "It's not about deserving," Xavier said simply. "It's about choosing, and I choose you past, present, and whatever future we create together." In that moment, looking into his steady gray eyes, Cecilia knew with absolute certainty that she loved this man. Not with the fleeting infatuation of youth, but with the deep, enduring love that grows from shared understanding and mutual respect. "I choose you too," she whispered. "If you'll still have me, knowing all the complications I bring." Xavier rose from his chair and knelt before her, taking her hands in his. "Cecilia Vaughn, will you marry me? Not someday, not when it's safe, but now today while we still have daylight left." The unexpectedness of it startled a laugh from her. "Today, here, why wait? There's a chaplain at the fort. We could be husband and wife before sunset." His thumbs traced circles on her palms. "Unless you need more time." "No," she said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "No more waiting. Yes, Xavier Miller, I will marry you today." His smile, a full, genuine smile that transformed his usually solemn features, was like sunrise after the longest night. He rose, pulling her to her feet and into his arms. The kiss that followed was tender at first, a gentle exploration, then deepened into something that promised passion and partnership in equal measure. They were married that evening in the fort's small chapel, with the chaplain and two young soldiers as witnesses. Xavier had somehow procured a simple gold ring from the trading post, and Cecilia wore a sprig of wildflowers in her hair that he had gathered from the hills surrounding the fort. The ceremony was brief but meaningful, the chaplain's words about facing life's journeys together especially poignant given their circumstances. When Xavier slipped the ring onto Cecilia's finger and promised to cherish and protect her all the days of his life, his voice held a conviction that brought fresh tears to her eyes. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the chaplain declared. "What God has joined together, let no man put asunder." Xavier's kiss was both tender and possessive, a claiming and a promise wrapped into one. For the first time in months, Cecilia felt truly safe, not because the danger had passed, but because she no longer faced it alone. They spent their wedding night in Xavier's room, discovering each other with the mixture of eagerness and reverence that marks the beginning of a lifetime's exploration. In the afterglow, lying in the circle of her husband's arms, Cecilia felt a peace she'd thought forever lost. What happens now? She asked softly, her head resting on Xavier's chest, his heartbeat strong beneath her ear. Now we head west, he replied, his fingers tracing patterns on her bare shoulder. I've been studying maps while waiting for you. There's land available in Oregon's Willamette Valley, good grazing, plenty of water, far from Chicago's influences. And your father, will you tell him what's happened? Xavier sighed. I'll write to him, explain as much as I can without putting him at risk. Maybe someday, when it's safe, we can see him again. He pressed a kiss to the top of her head. What about your documents? What do you want to do with them? Cecilia considered the question that had plagued her for months. They should be used to stop my father, she said slowly. But I don't want to be the one to use them. I couldn't bear to see him imprisoned, despite everything. Then we find someone trustworthy to pass them to, Xavier suggested. Someone with the influence to act on the information without involving you directly. Is there such a person? Xavier was quiet for a moment. Maybe. There's a judge in San Francisco I served under during the war, incorruptible, fearless. If anyone could handle this properly, it would be him. He tightened his arms around her. We could travel there first before settling in Oregon. The plan had merit. San Francisco was far from Chicago, and a federal judge would have the authority to act on the evidence without requiring Cecilia's testimony. It would mean delaying their fresh start in Oregon, but perhaps that was a small price for true freedom. Let's do it, she agreed. San Francisco first, then Oregon. She shifted to look into Xavier's eyes, and once we're settled, what then? His smile held all the promise she could have wished for. Then we build a life together, Mrs. Miller, a home, a family if you want one, a place where neither of us has to run anymore. I'd like that, Cecilia whispered, laying her head back on his chest. I'd like that very much. They departed Fort Bridger the next morning, traveling west with renewed purpose. The journey to San Francisco would be long and not without its challenges, but Cecilia faced the future with a hope she'd thought lost forever. Whatever came, she would face it with Xavier at her side, not running from her past but moving toward their future together. The journey to San Francisco took nearly 2 months, their progress slowed by caution and the need to earn money along the way. Xavier found work as a hired hand on ranches they passed, while Cecilia took in sewing or helped in kitchens when opportunity allowed. They traveled under the names John and Mary Smith, an obvious alias but effective for its very banality. By day, they covered ground steadily, avoiding main routes where they might be noticed. By night, they camped under the stars or, when funds permitted, took rooms in small roadside inns. Despite the hardships of travel, these were the happiest months of Cecilia's life. Free from the constraints of her Chicago upbringing and the constant fear of discovery, she discovered a strength and resilience in herself that matched Xavier's quiet capability. Their love deepened with each passing day, built on mutual respect and the countless small kindnesses they exchanged. Xavier taught Cecilia to shoot, insisting she be able to defend herself if necessary. She taught him to appreciate poetry, reading aloud from her treasured volume of Emerson during quiet evenings by the campfire. They shared dreams of the home they would build in Oregon and speculated about the children they might have, but the shadow of Edward Vaughn remained. Cecilia still woke sometimes in the night, heart pounding from nightmares of pursuit and capture. Xavier would hold her until the trembling subsided, his solid presence her anchor in the storm of memory. San Francisco greeted them with fog and the clamor of a city in constant motion. Ships crowded the harbor, disgorging passengers and cargo from around the world. The streets teemed with a diversity of humanity unlike anything Cecilia had ever seen: Chinese merchants, Mexican vaqueros, Europeans of every nationality, all drawn by the promise of California. They found lodging in a modest boarding house run by a widow who asked few questions and served hearty meals. The next day, Xavier went alone to seek an audience with Judge Hammond, the man he believed could help them. Better if I approach him first, he explained to Cecilia. If my judgment of his character is wrong, you won't be exposed. She agreed, though watching him walk away triggered the old fear that separation meant loss. While he was gone, she retrieved the documents from their hiding place in her luggage and reviewed them one last time. The evidence was damning contracts detailing bribes to city officials, letters threatening those who opposed her father's interests, accounting ledgers showing funds diverted to silence witnesses to unspecified incidents. Together, they painted a picture of corruption so extensive it had allowed Edward Vaughn to build an empire on the suffering of others. Cecilia felt the familiar mixture of shame and anger that her own blood was capable of such callousness. But this time, the emotions were tempered by resolve. Soon, these papers would be someone else's responsibility, and she could truly begin anew. Xavier returned late in the afternoon, his expression more relaxed than she'd seen it in days. "Hammond remembered me," he reported, "and he's willing to meet with us both tomorrow morning, both of us." Cecilia's stomach tightened with anxiety. "Is that necessary?" he insists. Xavier took her hands. "But he's a man of his word, Cecilia. He promised complete discretion, whatever you decide to share with him." The judge's chambers were located in a grand stone building that spoke of permanence and authority. Judge Hammond himself was a surprise, a small, wiry man with bright eyes and a gentle manner that belied his fearsome reputation on the bench. He greeted Xavier warmly and welcomed Cecilia with courteous interest. "Mr. Miller tells me you have information of a sensitive nature," he said once they were seated in his private office, doors firmly closed against eavesdroppers. "Yes, Your Honor." Cecilia's fingers tightened around the leather portfolio containing her father's papers. Information concerning corruption in Chicago that reaches to the highest levels of business and government. Hammond's expression remained neutral. "And your interest in this matter?" Cecilia glanced at Xavier, who nodded encouragingly. "The primary figure involved is my father, Edward Vaughn. If the judge was surprised, he didn't show it." "I see, and these documents came into your possession how?" "I discovered them in my father's study." Cecilia placed the portfolio on the desk. "When I confronted him, he made it clear that my knowledge put my life in danger. I've been in hiding ever since." Hammond opened the portfolio and began examining its contents, his face growing more grave with each page he turned. Finally, he looked up. "This is extremely serious evidence, Mrs. Miller. It implicates not just your father but several elected officials and business leaders." "I know," Cecilia said quietly. "That's why I've brought it to you. I want justice done, but I can't be the one to pursue it. My husband and I are starting a new life in Oregon. We need to put this behind us." The judge studied her thoughtfully. "What exactly are you asking of me? To use the information as you see fit without revealing its source," Xavier answered. "To ensure that those responsible face consequences while allowing my wife to remain anonymous and safe." Hammond leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled beneath his chin. "A difficult proposition. This type of case typically requires witness testimony." "The documents speak for themselves," Xavier pointed out, "and surely there are others in Chicago who could corroborate their contents if properly approached." "Perhaps," the judge conceded. He turned his attention back to Cecilia. "You understand that even if your name is kept out of official proceedings, your father will likely suspect your involvement," Cecilia nodded. "I've considered that, but there's a difference between suspicion and certainty, and with time and distance." She took a deep breath. "I have to believe that eventually he'll give up the search." Hammond was silent for a long moment, considering. "Very well," he said finally. "I will take these documents and begin a discreet investigation. I have colleagues in the Justice Department who can be trusted to handle the matter with appropriate care." He fixed Cecilia with a penetrating gaze. "But I must ask, are you absolutely certain this is what you want? Once set in motion, these wheels cannot be stopped." Cecilia met his eyes steadily. "I'm certain, Your Honor. My father has hurt too many people. It has to end." The judge nodded, satisfied. "Then I will do what I can. I recommend you continue to your destination as planned and establish yourselves there. It would be best if you had no further connection to this matter." As they rose to leave, Hammond addressed Xavier. "You've chosen a brave woman, Miller. Take good care of her." Xavier's hand found Cecilia's, warm and reassuring. "Every day of my life, sir." Outside the courthouse, Cecilia felt lighter than she had in months. The burden she'd carried since fleeing Chicago had been transferred to shoulders better equipped to bear it. She looked up at the clear blue California sky and took a deep breath of salt-tinged air. "It's over," she said, wonder in her voice. "Really over." Xavier smiled down at her. "One chapter ends, another begins." He tucked her arm through his. "Ready to start our life in Oregon, Mrs. Miller?" Cecilia returned his smile, feeling truly free for the first time in memory. "Lead the way, Mr. Miller. Our future is waiting." The Willamette Valley welcomed them with rolling green hills, fertile soil, and a climate milder than the Wyoming ranges Xavier had known. With the money they had saved from their journey, supplemented by a fortuitous encounter with a rancher looking to sell his small spread, they purchased 100 acres with a modest cabin, a barn, and good pasture for the cattle Xavier planned to raise. The property was 10 miles from the growing settlement of Springfield, close enough for occasional trips to town, but far enough to provide the privacy and peace they both craved. Their nearest neighbors were a half-mile away, a friendly family named Cooper with 3 young children who quickly adopted Cecilia as an honorary aunt. The first year was hard, as Xavier had warned it would be. The cabin needed extensive repairs, the fences required rebuilding, and the small herd Xavier acquired demanded constant attention. They worked from dawn until dusk, falling into bed each night exhausted but satisfied with their progress. Cecilia discovered talents she'd never known she possessed: gardening, preserving, even basic carpentry, as she helped Xavier expand their cabin to include a proper kitchen and a second bedroom for the future, as he said with a meaningful glance that made her blush. News from the outside world reached them sporadically. Occasionally, a newspaper from San Francisco or Portland would make its way to Springfield, and Xavier would return from town with updates about national events. It was through such a paper, nearly 8 months after their meeting with Judge Hammond, that they learned Edward Vaughn had been arrested on charges of corruption, bribery, and conspiracy. The article didn't mention Cecilia or any specific documents, attributing the case to information provided by confidential sources within the Chicago business community. It seemed Hammond had kept his word about protecting her identity. Xavier found her that evening sitting on their porch, the newspaper spread across her lap, tears streaming silently down her face. "Are you all right?" he asked, settling beside her and drawing her against his side. "Yes," she said, surprising herself with the truth of it. "It's just strange. To see it in print, to know it's really happening." "Do you regret it?" She considered the question carefully. "I regret that it was necessary. I regret that he chose power and wealth over basic decency." She leaned her head against Xavier's shoulder. "But I don't regret bringing the truth to light. Too many people suffered while he prospered." Xavier pressed a kiss to her temple. "You're a remarkable woman, Cecilia Miller. I fall more in love with you every day." She turned in his arms, offering her lips for a proper kiss. "And I with you." Life settled into pleasant rhythms. Their herd grew, along with Xavier's reputation as a rancher who raised quality stock and dealt fairly with all. Cecilia's garden flourished, producing enough vegetables to preserve for winter and share with neighbors. They added chickens, then pigs, and finally 2 milk cows that provided more than enough for their needs. In their second spring in Oregon, Cecilia confirmed what she had begun to suspect. She was expecting a child. Xavier's reaction to the news, speechless joy, followed by gentle concern for her well-being, only deepened her love for him. He insisted on hiring a young man from town to help with the heavier ranch work, allowing him to spend more time close to home as Cecilia's pregnancy progressed. Their son, Douglas James Miller, was born on a crisp autumn morning with the assistance of Mrs. Cooper and the local midwife. He had Xavier's storm gray eyes and Cecilia's auburn hair, a perfect combination, Xavier declared, cradling his son with a tenderness that brought tears to Cecilia's eyes. They sent word to Old Man Miller, who had indeed sold Silver Star Ranch but had used the proceeds to purchase a smaller property near Mineral Point, where he lived in semi-retirement. His response came weeks later, a letter full of grandfatherly pride and plans to visit once the little fella is old enough to appreciate his grandpa's stories. Life wasn't without its challenges. A harsh winter threatened their cattle. A summer drought made the garden struggle. Xavier broke his arm falling from a horse and couldn't work properly for weeks. But these were normal, manageable problems, not the life-threatening danger they had once faced. And through it all, their love deepened and matured, tempered by shared hardship and joy. Cecilia found herself thinking less and less of Chicago and her former life. The past receded, not forgotten but no longer defining her present or determining her future. Douglas was joined by a sister, Eliza Marie, 2 years later, and then by another brother, Samuel, the year after that. Their home expanded again to accommodate the growing family, a new wing with proper bedrooms for the children. A larger kitchen where Cecilia taught young Douglas to bake bread while baby Samuel crawled at her feet, and Eliza helped by getting flour everywhere. News came occasionally of Edward Vaughn. He had been convicted and sentenced to 15 years in prison. His business empire had crumbled, his associates scattered or themselves facing charges. The story faded from the newspapers as new scandals and sensations captured public attention. On a summer evening in their 6th year in Oregon, as they sat on their expanded porch watching their children play in the yard, Xavier handed Cecilia a letter that had arrived with the monthly mail delivery. "From Hammond," he said quietly. Cecilia opened it with steady hands, no longer feeling the surge of anxiety such communications had once triggered. The judge's message was brief but significant. Edward Vaughn had died in prison, a victim of influenza that had swept through the facility. She read the words twice, searching for the complex emotions she expected to feel: grief, relief, perhaps even vindication. But what she found instead was a calm acceptance. Her father had made his choices and had faced their consequences. The connection between them, once so defining, had been severed long ago by his actions and her courage to stand against them. "Are you all right?" Xavier asked, echoing the question he had posed years before when they'd first learned of her father's arrest. Cecilia looked up from the letter to the life they had built together, their thriving ranch, their beautiful children, the man who had seen her strength when she'd been most afraid. "Yes," she said, reaching for his hand, "more than all right." Later that night, with their children sleeping peacefully and the ranch quiet under a canopy of stars, Cecilia and Xavier stood together at the bedroom window, his arms wrapped around her from behind, her head resting against his chest. "When I ran from Chicago," she murmured, "I never imagined finding this. I was just trying to survive." Xavier's arms tightened around her, and now she turned in his embrace, lifting her face to his. "Now I'm not running anymore. I'm exactly where I'm meant to be." His kiss was as tender as their first and as passionate as their latest, a perfect expression of the love that had grown between a woman fleeing her past and the cowboy who had shown her a future worth staying for. In the years that followed, the Miller Ranch prospered, becoming one of the most respected in the Willamette Valley. Their children grew strong and independent, inheriting their father's steadfastness and their mother's courage. Douglas showed Xavier's gift with animals. Eliza developed Cecilia's sharp intelligence and love of books, and Samuel revealed a talent for building and invention that surprised them all. Visitors to the ranch often remarked on the special quality of the Miller home, the warmth that greeted them, the obvious devotion between Xavier and Cecilia even after decades together, the sense of peace that permeated the property. Few ever knew the full story of how they had come to Oregon or the dangers they had faced before finding their sanctuary. It was a tale they shared only with their children when they were old enough to understand its lessons about courage, justice, and the power of love to heal even the deepest wounds. And on summer evenings, long after their children had grown and started families of their own, Xavier and Cecilia could still be found on their porch, hands entwined, watching the sunset paint the valley in hues of gold and crimson. Not running, not hiding, but simply being together.